They were actually approved in the 1960s, and it was actually for female fertility at the time, but they've been used for male fertility for about that same time frame.
So in the 60s, it was approved for help with ovulation in women by increasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And about since the 80s, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, we've been using it off-label for men.
Yeah.
For spermagenesis, which involves increasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and for testosterone.
So fertility is spermatogenesis is like, again, you're trying to increase sperm, and fertility. So used for fertility, used for testosterone, used again in some of our patients for just maintenance of testicular size too. So welcome back to the podcast with me, your host, Dr. Debra Durst. And if you are new to the podcast, then hopefully you like merging science and sensuality, because that's what we do. And so if you like the content we're putting out, please like and subscribe and share with friends. And I am going to introduce my co-host. Let her introduce herself, actually. She doesn't need me to say it for her.
No, I got this.
You got it.
Hey guys, Fertility Golembiewski. I am a board-certified family nurse practitioner, and this podcast is a little bit different because this might be one we have a little bit of an imposing belief behind slightly.
We do. So this one we may end up sorting through as we go along. So what we're going to do is talk about Clomiphene and Enclomiphene, and again, what those are, what the difference is, what they're used
Why we use them.
for, or what they're used to treat, and then also how we use it in the office. And that's where our differing opinions will come into play. And so we always like to, again, deep dive into some studies, but we're going to also share how we use this in practice and what we're seeing. And so stay tuned to the end to get exactly our unique take on it, and maybe even how we differ on this topic and how we follow it. So again, what is Clomiphene and Enclomiphene? So we'll start with Clomiphene first, because this is the...
Or even just the class.
Yes.
Right? What class of medication? What class of medication do they fall under, Dr. Durst?
So these are SPERMs. So I'm sure that you have heard of SPERMs. So selective estrogen receptor modulators. And so again, that's what Clomiphene is. And so they're basically like a selective antagonistic estrogen receptor agent. And so they are blocking that at the hypothalamus level. And
pituitary.
And pituitary. And so basically with that, you're actually in the brain then inhibiting the negative feedback that would be caused by a rise in your hormones. So like for men, well, let's just start with, they were actually approved in the 1960s, and it was actually for female fertility at the time, but they've been used for male fertility for about that same time frame. So,
So in the 60s, it was approved for to help with ovulation in women by increasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And about since the 80s, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, we've been using it off-label for men.
Yeah.
For spermagenesis, which involves increasing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and for testosterone.
So fertility is spermatogenesis is like, again, you're trying to increase sperm, and fertility. So used for fertility, used for testosterone, used again in some of our patients for just maintenance of testicular size too.
Yes.
So basically, if your brain, so your hypothalamus has gonadotropin releasing hormone that goes to the pituitary, and then pituitary releases LH and FSH, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which go to the testes to produce testosterone
Through the Leydig cells,
or to the ovaries to produce estrogen. And so basically, once those are produced by your primary sex organs, then they're going to go back. You're producing the hormone, so it goes back, feeds back into the brain to shut down further production. It's like a negative feedback, and that's part of all of our hormonal system in the body. And so basically,
so this is the hypothalamic pituitary axis.
Yes, the HPA axis. Yeah, yes. It's a big word and a big combination of words.
And it is really just the brain talking to the testes and how they work together to make testosterone and estrogen and balance that between the two.
Yeah, so basically you have an HPA axis in men and women, And today we're going to actually talk about it because it came up more with men for us, and we don't do fertility in women. So for us, we're going to go ahead and right now separate out into men. And
Yes.
so basically, HPA axis is hypothalamus, pituitary, and your sex organ. And so actually, so it's not HPA, it's HPG, your gonadal orgasm, or there's a pun.
There
right?
we go.
Your gonad. So like basically we're talking about the testes now for men. And so then once you produce testosterone, it goes and it feeds back. And so this agent, clomiphene, is basically inhibiting that negative feedback so that you increase LH and FSH and therefore increase testosterone. And so that's how you increase testosterone, which therefore potentially increases spermatogenesis. But again, it depends on what that testicular or what that hypogonadism is from. And so again, it's treating hypogonadism. And so is that a central or is that a peripheral? Is it testes and peripheral or is it a central? So if it's central, it will treat it. And so then it'll increase those brain hormones and then increase testosterone. So that's a long drawn out, but again,
And then for some
right on the
men or
diagram,
older
but-
men, this is not a option for treating because we can treat it, but if the testes don't take that and convert into testosterone, if there's true testicular failure, then we need to do testosterone replacement therapy.
Yeah, and so hypogonadism is really decreased testosterone production. And we're talking about men here. Again, we don't do fertility in women. So we're talking about men, and that's how this came up in our office as well, was related to treatment for men. And so hypogonadism is decreased testosterone production. Is that from the brain not producing those hormones
So primary.
that are stimulating, and that's primary shutdown, or is that peripheral or secondary from the actual gonad or testes? And so again, if your reserve in the testicles isn't there, you're older, you're not producing it, or even young and not producing it for whatever reason, then we can give that, but you're probably not going to increase testosterone production. And so that's why it treats central. It will not treat a failure of the testes to produce. And so
that's
what
an
we're talking about.
important,
Yes.
that's a very important clinical pearl there.
Correct.
Because there are guys that come and go, oh, well, my friend took clomid. It's great. I don't want to get on testosterone. I'm just going to take clomid and it's going to work. Well, it has to make sense, right? So making sure that you're going somewhere that's looking at your labs, your initial labs, making sure that you are a candidate is really important.
Yeah.
Because it won't be for everybody. But most of our guys do well with it.
And correct, the more data points you have, so again, testosterone, free testosterone, binding globulin, and again, LH and FSH are important. And so when we get to the end, we'll
talk a little bit about that difference that
the
we have here.
FSH and LH, and we'll talk about that more. So the bottom line is that, again, clomiphene has been around since the
60s,
And
right?
so,
Decades.
yeah, decades, safe. And again,
Been around a long time.
we even are, we're having fun with the fact that there's isomers of clomiphene. So clomiphene has two isomers, again, so cis and trans is like the old terminology for isomers, period. And so maybe that dates me because I don't know, they've come up with new ones, right? So now there's
She had to explain it to me, guys. So,
Yeah, so-
it dates her a little bit.
it does, because cis and trans are like a very common, and L and right isomers. Like, so there's
like
I've
alpha and beta.
never- Yeah, but that's like, those are subunits, and like it's like alpha, beta, gamma, delta, like, but it really, and even those were like missing some of them usually. So I don't know.
But it breaks the science down and it makes it make sense.
So it's cis and trans in the old form. So, but basically clomiphene is the main molecule. There is two isomers in it. And again, one is enclomiphene, and that's about 70% of clomiphene. And then the cis or ZOO isomer is about 38%, right? And so there's two isomers in it. Clomiphene is present in a manufactured, FDA approved manufactured product for fertility. And again, I'm not sure, again, that it's definitely not approved for like testicular size, and and I'm not even sure about
It's indicated for spermogenesis.
but not for probably testicular increase. And so that's probably an off-label use. So just so that we know, again, it is an FDA approved. That means it's in a manufactured form available by your regular pharmacy, but you can get a compounded version of it, FDA regulated pharmacies that are making it. And so it doesn't, most of our manufactured versions you pick up from a regular pharmacy can be used off label. And so a compounded version is still a regulated pharmacy, highly regulated pharmacy, and an oral, not an injectable, so not like a sterile. But so that medication is the same. The root of it is the same, clomiphene citrate with those two isomers. And so you can just get different strengths of it and you can get different forms and you can do different things with it. But it still doesn't make it unsafe. And so that is a kind of misperception along the way. So when you talk about that, though, then all of a sudden there comes up this topic of enclomiphene. So
That why do you? I just want enclomiphene. I
Yes.
don't want clomiphene, just the enclomiphene, even
Yes.
though enclomiphene is part of clomiphene. So we had to go and break down and kind of deep dive into, okay, what's the difference between these two? And why would somebody just want enclomiphene? And what's interesting is that when we go back to the cis and trans 2 isomers, Dr. Durst brought up that clomid is FDA approved, off-label for men for testosterone. But then when we look at enclomiphene, it went through trials to be FDA approved. And it did not make it through trials because it did not show. Let me go back down to what it said. It was in 2015, the approval process stopped because in phase 3 studies, it was no longer adequate to demonstrate clinical benefit on its own for that singular reason. Yet, clomiphene's been around a long time. And we do see benefits with it. So we have a non-FDA approved enclomiphene, that is the pure form, without the zooclomiphene, without the second isomer. But what we see and what we hear is, oh, well, you're not going to get the estrogenic effects. Or you can have less side effects with it. But that's not necessarily true when you look at the data and the studies.
Well, looking at the data or in practice. So again,
In practice, we don't see it.
We have not seen issues with clomiphene across the board when we've used it. And so again, the ways that you can increase testosterone, for instance, so hypogonadism is decrease in testosterone. So how can you optimize testosterone? Well, you can give testosterone. That's number one.
Yep.
You can do that in an injectable form. You can actually do it in some, topicals. We don't use that often because it can cause a lot of side effects, lots of variability.
In plants like pellets.
Yeah. And so in pellets are a great way to do that. And, again, no injections, completely bioidentical. Then you can use HCG, which is an analog, like basically looks like LH in the body, but very hard to get now, very expensive because they made it where it couldn't be compounded. And so the manufactured form at a regular pharmacy is the way you get it now.
Name brand,
it's just
very expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive. And I think that had to do something with patent, maybe patent infringement, something along those lines. And then the SERMs. And so clomid is what we've been using. And again, clomid has both of those isomers in, and then suddenly there's like a push for this enclomiphene, which
is also more expensive, has to be compounded.
Correct. And so it's interesting because, again, it was a recent thing. So I think that, there's forums that pop up or maybe some videos talking about it. So we went and looked because, again, what is enclomiphene versus clomiphene? And so, again, clomiphene is the one that has both isomers and then enclomiphene alone. But actually, clomiphene has 70% of enclomiphene. So you're already getting 70% of it. You're getting a small version. And then we were looking at the science. Why does it say less estrogenic stuff? Because we're not running into issues in this clinical practice of clomiphene. So we have no issues with it.
We don't see a jump in estrogen.
No.
We very, very rarely see any negative side effects. Very rarely.
Correct. And sometimes that's in higher doses, if anything. And so again, we're always having conversations that there were actually some that were talking about the negative effects on estrogen. So it's confusing when you're watching videos. And of course, because some were talking about, the selective, again, antagonistic effects.
So it should shut
And
down
then so
estrogen
it should
production.
shut it down selectively in some way.
But in practice, we don't see dropped estrogen levels.
We don't see that, or we don't see dropped, like, and again, maybe again, men need estrogen too for erectile function, and it
And
depends.
desire.
And it depends on the man. Completely depends on the man, and that's how it's customized. Is because a man will basically let you know whether he likes his estrogen on the higher side or the lower side. And usually there's a typical standard range of maybe 15 to 45. We're trying to, maybe that's the goal range, but they will let you know where they like it.
They feel good.
Yeah, because they'll come in and there'll be a change, and you'll see a change in their estrogen level, but we're not seeing it related to clomiphene and clomiphene.
I'm not seeing crazy high jumps. I'm not seeing crazy high dips. Everything's pretty relational. As testosterone comes up, estrogen's going to come up as a byproduct of that. Even with that antagonist, we see those normal ratios. So if anything, if estrogen is a little bit on the elevated side, we usually can treat it through a more natural means. So we don't need to add another
Correct.
estrogen blocker like anastrozole or Nolvadex or anything like that. So in practice, I'm just not seeing that. I'm not seeing these negatives that have recently been brought up.
Correct. And I think that even if we weren't seeing levels, you could potentially hear side effects or a change, and we're not seeing even that, and definitely not related to increase, which is like breast tenderness or nausea,
Hot
or
flashes, mood swings.
Yeah.
The other one that is been brought up is, what about these vision changes? So I've not had any patient that's had floaters or vision changes with clomid. Anything that I found really related to that seems to be in the bodybuilding world in extremely, extremely high doses that are being used for post-cycle therapy after doing cycles of anabolics, which we don't do in our practice. So that's really where I'm seeing those more serious side effects. We're not seeing that in our normal dosing that we're doing.
Correct. And so I would go a little, so we did find some studies, hard to find, but 2 mice studies. And again, interesting because the mice studies were
60s,
actually,
right?
yeah, they were, well, even if they were like yesterday, they were mice, and they were like talking about the uterus and estrogenic effects of a uterus in a mouse.
Oh, I was just dating you with your.
I know you did.
With your trans and your cis.
You can. Oh, you want to make it seem like I'm going back to the '60s with my studies?
You know,
now
you
too.
are on one of them. Just saying.
Yes. Well, you just continue to date me. Well, I'm gonna size it instead, because you're talking about a uterus and a mouse, and even then, though, the trans or isomer, which is enclomiphene, basically had the more estrogenic effects. And so we've had patients asking us because they want the enclomiphene because it's supposed to be less estrogenic. But in fact, in the mouse studies with the small uterus, they actually had an increased estrogenic effect with the trans or enclomiphene. The only time that it was affecting or a little more cis or, the zoo isomer is when it was in really high doses, and then it affected the uterus of a mouse. And so, and then the other one, it didn't have anything about estrogenic effects either way. It basically said that the enclomiphene or the N isomer maybe had some more histologic effects on the testicles, but it didn't go into the details of what those are. So those are 2 very weak studies supporting anything about estrogenic positive or negative effects of enclomiphene. Enclomiphene is already enclomiphene. And so I'm kind of done with the argument, because I think that there's no benefit to enclomiphene over clomiphene. And then the FDA obviously felt the same way about that, because they didn't approve it
And they
when
stopped
they
the
attempted
study.
because it had no added benefit either. So you already have 70% of it, or maybe it's not quite that, but you have a significant portion of clomiphene as in clomiphene, and it doesn't add any benefit. And it works well, and it works well in our practice. We're seeing no issues with clomiphene. It can increase, and do the job that we're looking for it to do without side effects. And again, if they're having side effects, it has nothing to do with the fact that it's an estrogen related side effect. It's usually kind of overall, it's a medication and they might be having issues with it. But
And this
so
is
anyhow,
something
yeah.
that we use independently, that we use in conjunction with testosterone for some patients. And in both cases, we're just not seeing crazy changes.
Yeah.
I can have a guy on testosterone replacement therapy that's doing testosterone pellets, and for whatever clinical reason we're adding clomid, I don't see these crazy jumps in their estrogen levels. I do see their testosterone go up, and I have to accommodate that in their dosing, but I don't see
Correct.
crazy estrogen changes. I'm not seeing these mood swings and hot flashes and these other side effects that are being reported that can be avoided potentially with enclomiphene. We're just not seeing that. So I'm going to kind of myth bust that.
Yeah. So
In clinical practice,
Yeah.
I think on paper it sounds great, but clinically we just don't really see those changes.
So we don't see any negative changes with it, and we definitely do not see at this point after reviewing studies and what potentially could have been an advantage. We don't see the advantage. So I'm kind of putting it to rest.
Yep.
And we
First line for us is clomid.
is clomid, and so which is clomiphene. So again, we will look into things when somebody is coming to us with potential like, hey, have you used this? I want this. And so if we don't know enough, it's time to step back and look at the studies and see, is this, we love to learn, and is it something that we're missing and, need to change? But when it comes to clomiphene, again, so you already know it's inhibiting that negative feedback. So you increase LH and FSH and potentially are increasing testosterone. The testicles have to have the reserve to do so. Over 50, that might decrease some. And so we're going to follow those levels and, free in testosterone and see how that changes. Do we need to adjust anything else we're doing? And most frequently in an older guy or in a guy that wants clomid, it's either maintaining fertility, or it's three things. Like either I want to increase, but I don't want to go on testosterone.
Yeah.
I want to maintain fertility because I want children and I'm young or I haven't had them yet. Or my testicular size is small.
Yep. And I'm
And I
having
don't want that to
testicular
happen.
pain, or
Yeah.
they've shrunk,
Yes.
and I want them back.
Yes. And so again, that's all related to the guy. And so if it's important to them, then we address it, and we do have that conversation. So when it's a testicular size, is it they read something? Are they feeling it's important to their partner? Is it important to them?
Yes.
Because I can probably
Or is it
across
painful?
the board, because we have conversations with women all day long, can tell you women don't care.
We don't care.
No, they don't care about the size. But if it's important to the man, then obviously, then yes, then it needs to be addressed. And if it's bothering them, but usually, like
In
in
some
every
men,
other
it can
day,
become painful.
Yeah.
If there is significant scrotal shrinkage, it can be painful for some men.
Yes.
So clomiphene is a great option to try to increase that luteinizing hormone to help the boys drop, so to say.
Yeah, yeah. And again, every other day dosing, just because you can get tachyphylaxis to it. And so if they have trouble remembering that, have to go to an everyday, then you're talking about potential resistance, just so they know that. So usually 25 to 50 every other day. And then so watching levels. And so and one thing I will say before we kind of get into our, like debate on what we're following with clomiphene and is that it can be beneficial for glucose levels. And so I think that was one thing that came out with the enclomiphene, but it really wasn't related to enclomiphene. It was related to the fact that if you increase your testosterone levels or optimize, that it's a inverse relationship with metabolic syndrome or gaining weight. And so that, makes
It's
sense.
that what came
So,
first, the chicken or the egg,
correct.
right?
Yeah.
As testosterone drops, we know that can cause blood sugar issues. If we regulate and optimize testosterone, we can see blood sugar regulate. We can see those levels come down. We can see it help with that metabolic syndrome. We can see it help with our diabetic patients.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it does play a role. So, yes, it came up with enclomiphene, whether that's not just enclomiphene by itself, but enclomiphene within clomiphene.
Yes. Yeah.
As well. But is it really the enclomiphene, or is it the testosterone came up, which then helped glucose control.
Correct. And that's actually what they were even projecting out, is that it was really just the fact
The
that they were
testosterone.
optimizing testosterone. So I thought that was great. So, but basically, even in practice, so what it comes down to, and we've had this conversation multiple times, so it was a great time to do the podcast too about it, is that again, LH and FSH, and when we do it, how often do we need to do it, especially when
How do we
somebody
keep
is
screening?
on, yeah, how do we continue screening when somebody's on clomiphene? So if, again, women, FSH and LH are way more complex, somewhat, because when somebody comes to us initially with a man, you want to see is the central or peripheral, especially if they're younger. It's a very extreme low. Otherwise, 1% a year that it's decreasing, definitely over the age of 40. And so, 50% of men at 50, 60% at 60, 70% at 70 are going to have lower testosterone levels. And so that's not uncommon, but if somebody comes really young or it's a really low level, obviously you want to do, some other tests.
There are some clinical things that will automatically initiate us drawing a luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, prolactin level, things like that, based on the age, the history, kind of what we get from them clinically. So there is that. My guys that are, sorry, but 50 and older that are natural decline, I may not be drawing an LH and FSH because they are, more than likely we're doing testosterone. They don't want to do a clomid. They want to replace testosterone if that's an option for them because they want to feel better. And with their age, clomiphene may not even be an option for them. So when we're drawing those levels, if we're talking about maintaining function, fertility, scrotal shrinkage, always, 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 in my mind, you need an initial LH and FSH and always a baseline to see if it's even an option. It's clinical data, right? Those data points to make those decisions.
And we're not in disagreement with that. And so it's like
the after.
It's the after. So basically, a lot of our patients, again, we're doing it in addition to testosterone to maintain some release or testicular size. And we're not actually treating fertility specifically in our office. And so the hypogonadism is treated, and again, clomid is one of the options. So hypogonadism, by definition, is decreased testosterone production.
Decreased gonadotropins, which
yes,
decrease testosterone.
Yeah. So, and we're talking about men in particular right now. And so when we're using clomid to increase testosterone and fertility is an issue, so I think that isn't so much in play potentially, or just knowing that those are the ones that were, because if it's testicular size or they're older, following to see what their testicular or testicle or
Their
testosterone
luteinizing
levels
hormone.
are probably adequate. And LH and FSH, do they increase or not? Like if they've had children, they're kind of on clomid, but they're on testosterone too. I don't think across the board, if you're on clomid, automatically defaults to a check LH and FSH.
And this is where we were talking about levels. Dr. Durst goes, well, why do you have to check it? If their testosterone comes up, it's working.
Yeah.
Why keep checking?
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we get into a little bit different. I do like to check the levels, but I like to, it does depend. Not do I think that everybody always needs a luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone level? Not always, right? Like you said, for scrotal shrinkage, if the boys fluff out, it's working and we're doing good and we're not having any adverse effects, that's not somebody that you need to do an LH and FSH on regularly. But my guys that are worried about maintaining fertility, I do like to check those. Not every 3 months, every time we see them, but I do like to check those more regularly to make sure that those levels are coming up, that we are maintaining. Because if we're doing it and they're staying really low, then what's the point of giving it? As a kind of a check to make sure, okay, well, are we rising that LH high enough to even make a difference to counteract what we're doing with replacement therapy? Or my guys that are just doing clomid. I do like to watch those levels every time they come in.
So I think if they're on clomid alone, then a lot of times they're really just strictly a fertility. they want to maintain fertility, but they're having symptoms of hypogonadism,
Yeah.
right? And so my issue is if there are hypogonadal and not producing testosterone, you give them clomid, and say you even did, like their test doesn't rise enough, you're checking the LH and FSH, it's up, what level is that correlating with testosterone to the point where you're going to increase it? I mean, so to me, if it's maintaining fertility, to me, it's different than fertility treatments. That's where we differ
True.
probably, because I feel like if they want fertility and they have low test, they probably, then we're checking things that probably we're not even checking: spermatogenesis, like are they actually producing sperm? So there's other things, but we did go into it, and she points out a good point, like you can have low testosterone and still have sperm, but do you, is the question, I guess. And so,
Everything, all the data says that low testosterone does not necessarily equal infertility, that only 15%.
but then I think that that's when, like, so if they have low tests, so like, I guess in my mind, if they have low tests and they're seeing us for symptoms of low test and we're putting on clomid, I don't know that I would know enough on an LH and FSH but she does see more of the injectable. I will say, testosterone patient, I'm probably more of the pellet and the older man. So it's also a selection bias on both ends. And so I would feel like I probably wouldn't know what the LH and FSH and how much you can push it and how much clomid you
Because
can
I
push
will
it,
pull back.
and sperm. Like, are they producing sperm?
And I always recommend, and I will say this to all the listeners out there, if you are younger and you are worried about fertility but your testosterone's lower, you're having symptoms of low testosterone, I highly recommend you, if you are truly interested in fertility and want to have kids and you don't have kids and you're going to get on therapy, I tell all my guys, you can always go to a sperm bank. You can always make a deposit and freeze it and have that there if that's an issue. That's always an option to you. I think that's important for some of our younger guys that are like, I know I want to have children, but I'm not going to, I can't go 10 years feeling like this. And if clomid alone is not enough to bring their testosterone up, or if they have true primary failure, right? So if it is a failure at the pituitary level, and no matter what we do, it's not going to get that up or convert over to testosterone, if the testes fail and we can't get testosterone up, they're going to go on injectables. That becomes your only option. So if fertility is a huge concern, there's always the option to freeze your sperm. There's always an option to go and get
If
your
they're
sperm.
even producing it.
If they're even producing, or to go get a sperm count to know
That's
their
what I think
levels.
is the,
It's a
yeah.
sperm count, and there's a sperm bank. Those are always options available to you prior to doing injections.
See, I think that's probably the key, is that, and again, I think it's probably ultimately a selection bias, but like right now at our office, they almost started, and this wasn't Faraday specifically, but this is how this conversation started happening, is that any guy on clomid
They just started running 'em.
getting an LH and FSH. And I said that is unnecessary, because again, a lot of the testicular, or like test optimization and hormones, is related to symptoms of low T and low T, right? But they've had children, but they still want to maintain production, or it's a testicular size. And so it's a combination of both.
Yes.
And therefore, no combination of both needs, because it is going to lower their LH and FSH. And so it would confuse the picture. We wouldn't even know what to make of it, because they're on test, they're on clomid, or clomid is just a testicular size, or clomid is
Right.
just, I
Yep.
don't want to go on test.
For
So I think
testicular shrinkage, I don't think those guys need
Yeah.
every single time,
So-
because if they're not having shrinkage anymore, it's obviously effective. If they're not
Yeah.
having negative side effects, it's obviously a good dose. Those guys usually just need a lower dose. Those guys I don't think need it all the time, but there are some that I think that we should be running
So
regularly.
I think I would almost go to like it's the ones that are on clomid only or fertility.
Those are the bigger ones.
Because if we have test and clomid, they're actually going to probably decrease their LH and FSH with the negative feedback.
Absolutely.
But then they have the inhibiting of the negative feedback. So really, what do those numbers mean? And are they producing sperm? So
Right.
like I think if fertility is an issue and it's just not I want to maintain production because there is that population.
There
that we
is. I just
treat.
want to
Yeah.
keep the system going.
Yes.
They just don't want to shut down
Correct.
half the pathway.
Yeah. And so there'll be a lot of patients. So I don't think, again, unless if it's a fertility, and you're probably just seeing more of those patients.
I'm
than
seeing
I
a
am.
lot of some
Yeah.
of the younger guys. I'm seeing a lot of clomid only guys. The clomid only guys, I do run that LH and FSH because I do change dosing based on it.
So I don't think we're probably actually as in disagreement as we
I think it's
we
just our
are.
population maybe that we're seeing.
Well, I
that
think it's the population, and I just think that the staff suddenly and for some unknown reason started doing LHs and FSHs on everyone every 3 months that is on clomid, period, across the board.
yeah.
And I'm like, why? Why all of a sudden are we doing this? So I don't actually think that's probably coming from you, but I think clarifying now that if it's like maintaining production on a combo or testicular size, then they don't need it every 3 months. They don't need it.
No, I agree with that.
But I think
Absolutely.
if it's fertility, clomid only, or clomid test, but I would say clomid test, like I'm not sure we would know what the
So
results
you'll
really
see a
mean.
difference because on testosterone, not replacing, they'll drop to 0.1 or less than 0.1. And we'll see that go up. We'll see that LH go up with clomid on sometimes on some lower doses. It's pretty effective, even on 25 milligrams. Oftentimes, I've got to go a little bit higher to 50 milligrams, and then how often I'm dosing to get that number to move. Now, does it ever go to the high end of that spectrum while on testosterone replacement, doing injectables? Not likely.
And I think the other question, or two further questions, would be what is an adequate level for fertility of LH and FSH? And do all adequate levels of testosterone actually result in spermatogenesis? And further, are they even producing sperm? So I think as long as we across the board you need to see a fertility specialist if
Absolutely.
you
I think you should always
have,
do a sperm count.
yeah, low
Make
test,
sure you've been
low
making sperm.
LH and FSH, yeah.
And
Yeah.
then there's always, like I said, the bank that
Yeah.
you can sperm bank it.
Yeah. So I think then we're probably not in disagreement, but I think that educating the staff specifically we don't need to do it in these. It doesn't need to be an automatic clomid equals LH and FSH, but also probably making sure that those people have either declined or definitely have been recommended to, because I think that, again, does even high test absolutely produce sperm? Like as
So
an
no,
adequate
that's
test.
what
Yeah.
that's what it
Yeah.
that's what everything that I came across is that testosterone is not your indicator of your testosterone level is not your indicator of your
Sperm production,
effectiveness
yeah.
of sperm production.
Spermatogenesis.
Yeah, it is
So-
not. That it's because it's other hormones that play a role. Testosterone does play somewhat, right? That's part of those gonadotropins are a result of, but it does not correlate one with the other.
Yeah. So that'll be interesting. And it's probably not going to be something we deep dive into because we don't do fertility
Yeah.
overall like we will for the office standpoint and for our patients.
We always want
But
to do
again,
the best
yeah.
for our patients
Yeah,
always.
Yeah. So I think that us sorting through this has been good because we've had this discussion in the office many times. Like, hey, how do
And
we
our
win
listeners
patients?
out there
Yeah.
now, you're getting a little bit of kind of the back end of why we
Yeah,
do the levels
yeah.
that we do and why our thought process through that. If you don't agree with us,
Yeah.
let us know. If you agree with us, let us know. If there's any docs out there listening,
Yeah. And
put your input in. I'd love to hear your point of view.
And again, we're doing we are optimizing hormones. So men are seeing us for symptoms of low testosterone and we're optimizing, but we don't shut down systems. And so what Faraday is saying, like LH and FSH, and what is it doing? Clomid only, obviously, yes, and maintaining fertility, but just maintaining production is a separate. But also, I probably will end up looking into just the correlation of test and spermatogenesis because I'm kind of curious now to see what that means because, what all does go into it and what do they test when they do go to a fertility specialist, because we don't treat fertility, we're treating and optimizing hormones. But if fertility is a major issue, they want to have children, they come in with a 300 test, which we see a lot of
Yeah.
in like the 30s. And so that's an issue.
And then
why
part
is
of
that
that's also
happening?
lifestyle,
Yeah.
right? Alcohol use, diet, exercise, are we obese? So we're talking about
Aspect of it.
one very small aspect of the whole picture. When patients come to us, we are treating the whole picture. We are talking to them about diet and lifestyle and exercise. So we're just pulling one part of this, but we are very comprehensive in how we treat patients. I think it's important to kind of note that we do look at all of that. So when we say guys in their 30s coming in at 300, the conversation isn't, oh, go on testosterone. It's looking at these labs, looking at options, talking to them about their overall lifestyle.
Yeah.
And how that's affecting it and why they are 300
So,
at 30.
and I'm not going to say that we won't have a podcast on it, because actually, like,
We might,
somebody
because I think
else just brought up that there's less fertility, period, now. And why is that? Because they were talking about, again, there's less children. They were talking across the board.
But are we just getting
different.
smarter and having kids later?
Perhaps, but is there something else environmentally that's causing that? And what has happened since COVID? So there's a
That's a
lot
hot
of,
button there.
So there's a lot of, so it might be worth looking at the trend.
Yeah.
And then,
So if that's something you're interested in, let us know.
Yeah, let us know for sure. So I'm not opposed to it the more I think through it, because I think it is affecting some trends which are significant. And we will say that we're seeing those trends in practice, because we have been all the time. And they've even dropped into the 20s. That's so there's late 20-year-olds that are having low testosterone. And again, that gets a little more complex, because why is that happening? And so,
And
so
not
I mean,
all
it's
of
interesting.
them
Yeah.
are overweight or abusing alcohol or drugs
No,
or
not
anything
all.
like that. Some of them are in fantastic health, taking care of themselves.
Yeah. So I would love to see the
Like
trends.
you said,
So,
those are a little bit more complex. We have
Yeah.
more going on there. But
yeah. And we definitely will look at the trends overall. I think that'd be an interesting podcast. So I take that back, that I wouldn't do a podcast, and I think we should. But anyhow, thanks for listening into our little mini debate, or mental masturbation, as I would call it sometimes. And so let us know what your thoughts are, and share anything you want to hear about, because we're willing to deep dive into anything sexual wellness or wellness.